The movie was produced in 2023. As the movie begins, a woman named Grace is seen in a desolate compound, dragging a lifeless man on the ground. Another character, observing her actions from a distance, retreats and conceals himself to avoid being noticed. He decides to capture her on video using his phone but ends up capturing only the motionless body, and not Grace herself. Confused and concerned about her whereabouts, he turns around, but before he can react, she strikes him across the face, causing him to lose consciousness. In the following scene, the camera pans over a landscape shot of Lagos City while a female radio presenter's voice is heard in the background. The main character, referred to as the cabman, is sitting in his taxi, preparing for a ride with his passengers, Mr. and Mrs. Williams, who settle in the backseat. Angrily, he turns around and questions why no one is sitting in the front passenger seat with him. Irritated by his arrogance, the couple threatens to end the trip. He defiantly tells them to do so, but they eventually agree to let the man sit in the front as they are running late. They arrive at their destination shortly thereafter, and as the man and his girlfriend enter their home, they are confronted by his ex-girlfriend, Grace. She begs for his love and refuses to accept his declaration that he no longer loves her. She then threatens to harm herself by slitting her wrist with a knife she pulls from her hood. As he tries to stop her, she stabs him, causing him to collapse on the floor, bleeding profusely. His girlfriend kneels beside him, crying, and Grace strikes her on the head, rendering her unconscious. In the next scene, the cab driver complains about not receiving payment from the man for the ride and decides to return to the passenger's house. Upon entering, he witnesses Grace dragging the bodies of her victims. As he attempts to record her, she knocks him unconscious. He wakes up, finding himself tied to a chair in a room. He pleads for his life and panics when Grace points a gun at his head. The scene fades out with the sound of a gunshot. In the subsequent scene, Mrs. Williams is being interrogated by a female detective, who accuses her of murdering her husband based on the evidence. Mrs. Williams pleads her innocence and insists that Grace, her husband's ex-girlfriend, committed the murder. However, the detective is skeptical, as the security cameras were disabled, and only Mrs. Williams had the access to do so. In the following scene, the cab driver opens his eyes and realizes he wasn't shot. Grace stands beside him and demands to see his phone. She deletes the video he captured and offers to release him if he promises never to speak of their encounter to anyone. He quickly agrees, and as she attempts to untie him, his phone receives a notification. Grace checks the message from his friend Sadiq, discussing the video he sent before losing consciousness. Grace becomes hysterical and insists that he takes her to meet Sadiq, who frequents a brothel. While driving through the streets of Lagos en route to the brothel, they encounter a police checkpoint. Grace places the gun against the cab driver's back and instructs him to act normally. He tries to get the police officer to arrest him in an attempt to escape from Grace. He lies about his expired driver's license and even insults the officer. As the officer moves to arrest him, Grace rolls down her window, and the officer recognizes her. They exchange pleasantries, completely ignoring the cab driver's signals. The officer asks them to continue on their way, and as they drive off, he laments bitterly at missing his opportunity to get away from Grace. Meanwhile, Mrs. Williams gets drilled by the detective, who informs her that Grace has been removed from the suspect list, as her travel history states that she has been in Ghana for about 2 months and still is. As they arrive at the brothel, the cabman gets into an unfriendly scuffle with one of the sex workers, who he previously tangled with and didn't pay. He tries to get them to read an sauce note he wrote for them, but they refuse and insists he pays up. She pays his bill and they inquire of Sadiq, and they are told he no longer visits the brothel, as he too owes them money. As they get back into the car, she makes him call Sadiq to know of his whereabouts. He informs them he's at the mortuary, because he works there. As they drive along, he stops the car in the middle of the road and lies to Grace that it's faulty. She finally agrees that he gets down to fix it, and as soon as he does so, he runs off. She gets out of the car, infuriated, and shoots at him but misses. He wakes up hours later in his room, after he dreams of Mr. Williams begging him to save his wife's life, as she was earlier convicted of his murder and sentenced to death by firing squad. He dresses up and looks out of his window. He panics when he sees Grace outside, showing his pictures to people and asking of his home. He runs through the back door and meets with Sadiq, who he begs to give him the video he sent to him earlier so he could show the police as proof that Grace is guilty. In the final scene, the cab driver saves Mrs. Williams' life, just before her execution, as he shows the officers the video evidence. Mr. Williams is released and Grace is arrested and sentenced to death. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification button so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.